Okay, so Anton, maybe you can talk a little bit about your approach to best practices in lecturing here at RMIT.
Sure. So there's lots of things that I try to do, and hopefully I'm successful most of the time when I'm giving a large lecture to a couple of hundred students. One is being mindful of attention spans. I think in a smaller group it's easier to pause, and it's also easier for students to ask questions if they don't understand things. In a large group, they may not be comfortable doing that. So one of the things that we try to do is build in mini breaks as often as possible. Hopefully there's a pause at least every 20 minutes or so, if not sooner. One of the common things that I try to do during those mini breaks is, first of all, we often put up a PowerPoint slide that just says, basically, turn to the person next to you, have a conversation about what we've just been talking about, and then ask questions of that other person. If there's a common misunderstanding, then put up your hand. So we call it simply turn, talk, and ask. The students have come to expect that, and those mini breaks I think are good if hopefully they're talking about the content and helping each other to understand, but they may also just need a little bit of time to decompress, a time to stop paying attention so intently to listening to me speaking in English. Maybe even if they're just having a conversation in Vietnamese about something else, it's a bit of a rest, and they need a bit of a, as well as me, they need a mental rest from time to time during the lectures. One of the other things that I do when I get questions like that, and is, I may have during a particular pause, I may have in mind that I want to answer, or we have time to answer 2 or 3 questions before moving on to the next topic, for example. So when I get the first question, I will announce to the class that I've received a great question. And the idea behind whether it's a great question or not, or whether I think it's a great question or not. And the reason for that is basically to encourage, to praise a student who has asked questions with a view to creating an environment where students feel more comfortable doing it, even in a large lecture format. What I like to do is take polls. So, we do on some of our slides, we have multiple choice questions, for example, and often we'll just have a show of hands. So how many people think A, how many people think B, hands up, and or simply yes or no type questions. And sometimes students don't want to put up their hands because they're perhaps afraid of being wrong. So sometimes I will ask several times. Okay, well, only about 20% of you actually voted yes or no to that particular question. Let's try again. Don't be scared. And I also, one of the learning outcomes of the course is for students to be able to construct arguments, see both sides of an issue, tolerate ambiguity. Things are not black and white, they're often gray. And so one of the things that I often do is express my happiness or delight when I ask a question and there's a show of hands and roughly half the class says yes and half the class says no. I actually try to communicate to them that that's a good thing because that we're dealing with complicated issues. One of the other important things I think is, at the beginning of a lecture, I always give a review of what preceded the lecture. So last week we were talking about this, and I will do that with student participation. So I'll say, well, what were we talking about last week? And again, it's about, I think one of the ways, the main ways to make a lecture, a large lecture more interactive is to praise participation. And also, it doesn't have to be a student giving a long-winded summary. I'll often, thank a student and for giving a one-word response to what is it that we studied last week, and they'll say, contract formation, and I'll say, that's great, thanks for that, and sort of build from there.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the way that you try to start off your classes.
Right. Okay. So I think one of the first things that I try to remind myself to do at the beginning of every class, and hopefully throughout the class actually, but that's to smile and give a kind of a friendly greeting. I have this habit of announcing to the students happy whatever day of the week it is. So if we have a lecture on Monday, I'll say happy Monday. And they think it's a little bit silly, but it's usually, even though I do it every week, you get a little bit of a chuckle. And then I move on to kind of refreshing the student's memory as to where we were at when we last met. So I'll ask a question about, well, what is it? What were some of the things that we were talking about last week when we met? Sometimes I don't get an immediate response, and I have to be a little bit patient. One of the things that I think students have realized is, and one of the things that students often do actually, is they'll whisper an answer, or it'll be so faint. I often hear the correct answer about what we were studying last week, or an answer to any general question as a whisper. You know, that they've got the right answer, but they're a little bit afraid to shout it out. And I have to listen carefully, and hopefully I catch it and I say, I heard you, you were right, just say it again. So reviewing where we were at last class, and actually I sometimes hopefully fairly quickly, just sort of give them a little bit of a roadmap. This is where we were, this is where we are, this is where we're going. Sure. Yeah, so that's how we start.
So can you talk a little bit about ways that you use active learning approaches to teaching in a large lecture?
Right. So one of the first things that I would say about that is that I think there's a misconception that if you're in a large kind of lecture format that you have to be talking yourself in a monologue for an hour. I can't do that anyway. I get tired, and I'm sure the students would get tired of listening to me. So one of the things that we do a lot is take polls. So you know that we'll be presenting a particular problem to the students. If it's a simple type question, then just give the students a few seconds to think about it, and then take a poll. How many students say yes? How many students say no? And encouraging them to sort of vote with their hands a little bit. It makes them move their body a little bit, gets them a little bit involved. One of the other things we do is have more official kind of mini breaks throughout a lengthy lecture, where we'll put a problem up on the slide. They'll have to read through it. I'll ask them to work with the people close to them, usually in pairs, and just talk about the problem and trying to come up with a solution. And then I'll invite a student to volunteer their answer. And again, in terms of getting more participation and kind of active learning in a large lecture format, I think one of the keys is whenever there's even a hint of active learning or proactivity on the part of a student, to really praise it, to make the other students see, well, look, they barely did anything, and the teacher is really happy about it. And hopefully that builds over the course of a semester, so the students become more and more comfortable. That's great. The other thing I think is moving around the room. You know, again, you know, if a student is suddenly having a one-on-one conversation with me, or asking a question of me when I'm at the front of the room, then all the eyes of the other students, or at least their perception of that student might be, all of the eyes of the other student are going to focus on them, and they might be uncomfortable with that. So walking up and down the aisles a little bit, taking breaks for questions, and physically relocating myself allows one-on-one conversations with a little bit more privacy, which encourages students to not be shy or afraid to ask questions.
So in terms of delivery, maybe talk about the way that you grade your language and your approach to teaching for second language learners.
Right. So one of the first things I would say about that is I don't necessarily worry about talking about every detail that's in a lesson plan or for a lecture, or you know, talk about every point that's on a bullet point in a PowerPoint slide. What I want to focus on is students, as much as possible, understanding the basics of what I'm saying. And so I tend to speak slowly, much more slowly than I would in a regular conversation. I'm very much aware of enunciation, so I try to pronounce the words as clearly as I possibly can, with a view to them understanding. I repeat myself. Some students have told me in the past a little bit too much, but I'm sure that there's the corresponding bulk of students who you know, need that. They need the repetition. And when I repeat, I tend to use synonyms, and hopefully students are catching on that I'm not moving on to a new concept, or I'm not discussing a new idea. I'm simply I'm describing the same idea using different words, and my hope is that you know, there may be some students that know one of the words, there may be some group of students that know the other, and they're both going to be receiving the message as a result of my repeating but changing the language a little bit.
Can you talk a little bit about what you feel are the qualities of an effective lecturer within this context?
I think when students transition, our Vietnamese students transition from high school to studying at RMIT Vietnam, some of them are quite shocked by the fact that we don't pay as much attention to whether they come to class or not. And I think that some of them might be at risk for drifting away because they perceive that maybe we don't care. And so I think one of the qualities that I try to show in the students as much as I can, with the students as much as I can, is to show that I care. You know, that I care about them, that I'm being respectful. I try to identify with their interests. And in the big lecture format, one of the things that I try to do is, well, as well as tutorials, small groups as well actually, is get away from the idea that somehow I'm the authority on this, even this subject matter, which is, you know, so I guess an area of expertise for me, but I want the students to realize that the teacher, the big boss, whoever it is, doesn't know everything and doesn't always know best. And so one of the things that I do with students quite often, and I've seen on their faces before a little bit of shock, is in answer to a question, say, I don't know. I have no idea, you tell me. And they're quite surprised by that. But what I'm trying to do is empower them, like to have them say, well, look, I don't have all the answers. And this is a situation to which you can, you know, we have some concepts in the course that you're meant to apply, but you can also apply your own common sense, your own life experience, and we all have those things. And so hopefully that message gets across.